want to talk about today as we wrap up this series, Above the Noise, is I want to talk about how do we as a people live a life of vision. How do we as a people live a life with strong, clear, powerful, future-shaping vision. And I want you to know, I believe each and every one of you in this room, you have within you the capacity to live with a vision that creates a better future. In fact, our vision here as a church is to point creatives to their Creator, that they would become fully alive followers of Jesus. We believe each and every one of you, you are a creative being because you were created by a creative God. And that means that you and I together, we were created to create. And just as ants create colonies and bees create honey, I believe we are called and created to create futures that we can pass on to the next generation. But we can never create a future worth passing on if we're not even living right now in the present with a very clear vision. And so I want to talk about what that looks like for you and I on a personal level. This series, Above the Noise, has been really about how do we rise above the noise and chaos of our world and of our time and live a life of clarity. And we believe a life of clarity is possible. Some of you need to write that down because you've believed the lie that clarity is not possible. It is. You can live a life of clarity even in a world of chaos. And we've been talking about some ways you can do that. And it's not by any means an extensive list, but we've talked about a few important things. The first, compassion. That when you become a means to somebody else's end that is not you, you begin to live with greater clarity. When your life is all about your life, that's when you really lose a vision worth living for and living a life of just adding to the noise instead of living from a place of clarity. Then we talked about comparison. If you want to live a life of clarity, you got to get out of comparison and live a life of contentment. And then we talked about how if you're going to live a life of clarity above the noise of life, you've got to slow down. And in a hustle-obsessed world, that's really difficult, isn't it? In a world that seems to glorify and worship those who work 70, 80 hours a week as a badge of honor, I think it's to no one's surprise that as a result of this, we are one of the most medicated people in the history of the human story. We are living at a pace that our souls were not created to live. And if you want to live a life of clarity, sometimes the best thing you can do is to slow down. And so we talked about that. And then last week we talked about something that I'm really passionate about. We are here, especially at Canvas, is that if you want to live a life of clarity, you cannot do that alone. You just can't. Like I need you in my life, and you might need me because together we can see things that we can never see on our own. We all need, as I said it last week, and I've said it historically here at Canvas, we need seeing eye humans, people who will fight our battles back to back because we cannot see behind us, but they can when they stand with us. They see from angles and perspectives that we don't see, and we need that because we have a clearer picture of life when we're doing life in community. And then this week, I just want to talk about, hey, if you want to live a life of clarity, then you got to live a life of vision. Let me give you just this sort of big idea from the message today. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. It's simple, but it's so important for your life. And it's this, that every victory starts with vision. That every victory starts with vision. Victory, I believe, always happens twice. Victory, true victory, always happens twice. First, it happens in your mind, and then it happens in real life. Like no one just sort of like stumbles into victory. Like, whoops, I just did something that changed the world. Whoops, I just did something that transformed my marriage. Whoops, I just was victorious in my finances. How did that happen? Like that, it doesn't just sort of happen. You never are accidentally victorious, but you envision victory in your mind before you experience victory in person. And so it's important to understand that victory starts with vision. Victory in your marriage starts with actually having a vision for your marriage. Victory in your friendships means having a vision for your friendships. Victory in your vocation means having a vision for your vocation. Victory in your mental or physical or emotional health means having a vision for your mental, physical, or emotional health. Victory in your faith means having a vision for, like, what does that actually look like to live a life of healthy and dynamic faith? Like, victory always starts with vision, which means this, that for some of us, the thing standing between you and victory in your marriage is not a better spouse. If you're married right now, just nudge them, be like, you ain't gonna find nobody better, buddy, all right? Like that's a better spouse is not standing in between you and victory in your marriage. New friends is not the thing standing in between you and victory in your community. Getting that promotion is not the thing standing in between you and victory in your job. Losing those 10 pounds or just having a little bit more joy is not the thing standing in between your victory of your emotional or physical health. Going to a new church is not the thing standing in between you experiencing victory in your faith, but the thing most often standing in between our victory is a lack of vision, which is problematic because we live in an age of distraction. I think every generation has its battles. I don't necessarily want to pretend that it's harder to be human now than maybe years before, but I think it's harder to be focused now more than years before. Like, I think every generation might have their battle, and I think the battle, or one of the many battles of our generation, is how in the world can you live a life of clear, singular vision in an age with so much distraction? It's becoming harder and harder to truly live out a vision, especially social media doesn't help because you see everyone else looking like they're living out their vision and you're wondering what's wrong with your vision and then you're comparing and then you're struggling to know what should I do. It's so distracting. But here's why we need to talk about this today, because everyone ends up somewhere in life, but very few end up somewhere on purpose. Like everyone ends up somewhere in life, but few end up somewhere on purpose. You don't get to choose whether you will end up somewhere in life. At the end of your life, you will have ended up somewhere because life only moves one direction forward. So you will end up somewhere in life. But the question is, will you end up somewhere in your life on purpose? And this message has just been really in my heart this week because I want you to know, if you remember anything, remember this: your life is far too short and your life is far too valuable for you to live your life without a vision. Your life is far too short and your life is far too valuable to live your life without a vision for your life. I don't want you just to get somewhere in life. I want you to get somewhere on purpose. And I think each and every one of you have the capacity to do that. So how do we do that? And what does the Bible have to say about that? Well, luckily, there's this powerful story in the Hebrew Scriptures. And if that terminology is confusing to you, that's what many Christians would call the Old Testament. But Jewish people don't call it that. They call it the Hebrew Scriptures. And in the Hebrew Scriptures, you have the story of a man named Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, in so many ways, has become this sort of archetype of what it looks like to be a leader. Over and over again, in sermon series after sermon series, Nehemiah is brought up as sort of this really great picture, practical picture of what it looks like to be a leader and what it looks like to live a life of vision. And Nehemiah is so interesting because his story begins, and he is the cupbearer to the King Artaxerxes in the year 444 BC. He is nothing more than like the ancient intern, right, of the ancient world. He is bringing the king his coffee. That's about it. And so if you're here and you're saying, well, maybe if I had an uncommon job, then I could do uncommon work. Nehemiah's story would confront you on that and challenge you on that because he had a common job and he would use his life to do an uncommon work for the common good of others. And so you may feel like you're a common person or working a common job. I want you to know Nehemiah reminds all of us that no matter how common you may feel you are or how common you feel your job is, each and every one of us are created, called, and wired to do an uncommon work. And the good news is this: it's not as difficult as you think. It's not easy, but it's also not as complex as we make it. I think when it comes to personal vision, we make it far more difficult than it actually is. And my hope today, through the story of Nehemiah, is you would discover, wait a second, living with a personal vision is actually much easier than I thought it was, but I have to have the courage to actually begin to do it. So Nehemiah, what happens in this story is Israel is 70 years, been in slavery for 70 years in Babylon. And when Nehemiah enters the story, Israel is going back home for the first time after 70 years. And when they return to Judah after 70 years of slavery, they see that the city that they left when they were enslaved is now basically torn down to the foundation. And Nehemiah takes note of one thing, and that is that the walls of Judah have been broken down, and all of a sudden, the broken walls do something inside of Nehemiah. The broken walls around him sort of created a brokenness within him, so much so that he could not stand by and do nothing. And that's where this story begins in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. It says this: "Early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I never appeared sad in his presence, and so the king asked me, 'Why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled.' And then I was terrified. But I replied, 'Long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire.' And the king asked, 'Well, how can I help you?' With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, 'If it pleases the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried.'" So Nehemiah, in so many ways, he serves as an illustration for all of us if we're to rise above the noise of chaos and the noise of distraction and live a life carrying out this vision that God has put within each and every one of us. But it's so important to see that here at the beginning that Nehemiah is a man who chose to do something when it would have probably been easier to do nothing. That Nehemiah chose calling over comfort. He had a great job. He was serving the wine to the king, to the most powerful person in the world. And yet he chose this calling to go and rebuild the walls of his home and leaving comfort behind. You see, Nehemiah, he chose to cross the line and go beyond being a dreamer to actually being a visionary. And you know, dreamers and visionaries are different, right? Dreamers and visionaries could not be more different. Dreamers dream about things being different. Visionaries actually go out and make a difference. Dreamers talk about what should be done. Visionaries actually go out and do it. Dreamers talk about the way the world should be, and visionaries go out and actually create that world. Visionaries and dreamers could not be more different. And I think you might agree, we have enough dreamers in the world. We have enough people who will go on Instagram and share their post about how the world should be, but then they'll go into the office on Monday and not actually create that world. See, the world does not need more dreamers. They need more visionaries, people who not only see the future, but are willing to go out of their comfort in order to turn that future into a reality. And I want to remind you something. I believe that you are meant to be more than a dreamer. I believe that you are capable of being more than a dreamer. I believe that within each and every one of you is a visionary that this world needs. That there is a visionary within you that will nudge the world in a better direction if you will free that visionary. Begin to not just talk about what needs to be done, but actually go out and do it. The question is, because you're like, Travis, you make it sound so easy. The question is, how do you actually do it? How do you, in a world full of distraction, actually go out and be the visionary that God knows you are? And I want to tell you, I know you are as well. How do you actually begin to do it? Well, luckily, Nehemiah's story gives us three, I think, really, really practical ways that we can begin to live into that visionary identity that you possess. Let me give the first thing. If you're taking notes today, the first thing we see in the life of Nehemiah that is so critical, especially in the moment we find ourselves in, the times we find ourselves in, is this. If you want to become the visionary you were created to be, you got to pay attention to the tension. You got to pay attention to the tension. What is my vision? What should I do with my life? What is my greatest contribution to this world that I find myself in? I don't know if any of you have ever felt like, man, I wish I was born in like a different era. You know, some of you are like, I think I was born in the wrong era. But friend, I want you to know if God wanted you in that era, you would be born in that era. You're in this era for a reason. That's not in my notes. That's just, I feel like God wants me to remind somebody today. You were born when you were born and in this time because God has equipped you and called you to be a part of shaping this moment in the human story. And so how do you begin to do that? Well, first, you got to pay attention to the tension. This story of Nehemiah shows us that the origin of vision is tension. I think many of us think the origin of vision is inspiration. So we're like, just sitting here and waiting for inspiration just to hit us. And then we're like, oh, that's what I should be doing all my life. Why didn't I know? And this inspiration hits you, and then you go, that would be awesome if it worked that way, but it just doesn't work that way, does it? See, the origin of vision is not inspiration. The origin of vision is tension. And tension is that space between the way things are and the way things should be. Tension is that space between the way things are and the way they should be. In fact, if your vision doesn't actually take the world from where we are to where we should be next, then you don't have a vision, you probably have a memory. And if your memories are greater than your vision, we're in trouble. That's what's concerning about some of our leadership in our country, right? That it feels like we are more interested in replaying the past instead of actually creating a better future. But I believe God's people are called to actually be future creators. And there's no way to create the future without tension, without being in that space of where you are and where you were always meant to be. And this is where Nehemiah finds himself. He finds himself in this moment in the history of his people where they go back home after 70 years of slavery. And when they return home, the walls are broken down, which is significant because what that means is that city, those people, the Israelites, they are now vulnerable to attack again. The walls were a symbol of strength and protection, and those walls were torn down. So when he sees the broken walls, it's more than just like, oh man, that's a bummer. We should put that back together. It's like, no, we are in a position of vulnerability, and this must change or we're going to be back in slavery again. And so he's seeing where they were and where they must be. He doesn't want to go back to slavery. He doesn't want to go back to the way they were. He wants to advance the nation of Israel forward. And so he sees that something has to happen. These walls have to go back up. And I love what he says to King Artaxerxes. You probably caught it. It's really powerful, right? The king says, why are you so sad? And then Nehemiah who goes, how can I not be sad? How can I not be sad? How can I not do something? How can I not feel this? How can I not be angry? How can I not be bothered? Can I ask you something? What is it in the world right now that when you see it, you're like, how can I not do something about this? What is it in the world, maybe in your workplace, if the world is too big of a thing for us to lean into right now, what about your workplace? If you're still too big, what is it in your family? If you're how can I not do anything about this? How can I not respond? How can I not be angry? How can I not be sad? How can I not feel this tension in my gut? What is it that you are seeing that everyone else maybe sees, but they move on, but you still see it? And you're like, why aren't we doing anything? What is it that makes you slam your fist on the table and says, enough is enough? Pay attention to the tension. Because that is the window where vision is born. But here's the problem. If that space between where we are and where we should be is called tension, and tension is the origin of vision, then that means vision is really painful. If you want to be a person of vision, get ready. It's going to hurt. In fact, if you want to live a life of passion, I hear it all the time. How do I live a life of passion? Do you know the literal translation of passion means to suffer? So when you're I want to live a life of passion, what you're saying is, I want to suffer. And you know this, right? Because if you've ever lived a life of passion, you know your passion will be the source of your greatest joy, but it will also be the source of probably your greatest suffering. It will be the thing that breaks your heart the most, and yet you can't quit it. You continue to move forward and continue to push through because this is your passion. Be careful what you wish for when you wish for a life of passion, because when you wish for a life of passion, you are also opening yourself up to suffering. We have people here in this church that have a passion to end sex trafficking in this world because the very thought of humans being trafficked by other humans makes their heart hurt. And they would easily say this is one of the things that causes them to suffer, to see these stories, to see what's going on, and to be a part of this work. And yet they don't stop because they see the way things are and they know it's not the way they're meant to be. And so they live in the tension. Or there's others of you that you see this one planet that we have been given to inhabit, and you see how we as human beings are slowly but surely destroying it. And you're like, we cannot tolerate this. This is not okay. And your blood begins to boil. And yet it will also be the very thing that causes suffering and pain in your life. And yet you don't stop because you are committed to going from where we are to where we must be and to pay attention to the tension. Maybe this is the reason many of us fail to live a life of passion or vision. Because here in the West in particular, we have been given this message, and for many of us, we've fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker, and that is, if it hurts, it must not be right. If it's not easy, then it must not be right. And I can tell you as a pastor how many conversations I've had with people who are like, I felt like God called me to do this work. And so I tried to do the work. And then it was really hard. So obviously God is telling me not to do that work anymore. Which I find interesting. Because the very story at the center of Christianity is Jesus Christ, who had a vision to take humans from where they are to where they must and were always created to be. And that vision led him to the cross. It's interesting that many of us, we want to experience the calling of Jesus, but we do not want the cross of Jesus. We want passion, but we don't want suffering. We want vision, but we don't want tension. But it's a package deal. You get both. If you want vision, then pay attention to the tension. So some of you are like, what's my calling? What's my vision? What does God want me to do in my life? If you come up to and ask me that, I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to say, what breaks your heart? What makes you angry? What keeps you up at night? What is it that you don't understand why more people don't care as much as you do about this? What is that thing? Pay attention to the tension. And when you do that, you'll be close to a vision. But the second thing is just as simple, but not as easy, and that is you got to stick to your simple. You got to pay attention to the tension, and then you got to actually stick to your simple. You got to stick to what you can do. King Artaxerxes, he says to Nehemiah, how can I help you with this? And after a short prayer, we're told Nehemiah, he says, look, the walls are broken, so I guess I just need to go and build back the walls. It really wasn't this whoa, how'd you think of that, Nehemiah? It wasn't this mind-blowing strategy. And we have no indication that Nehemiah has his master's in wall building. That's not his thing. We have no idea if this, why, but he's just well, the walls are broken. I guess I need to grab some bricks. I guess I need to start putting this thing back together. See, I think for many of us, if you're going to know what your vision is, pay attention to the tension, then begin to stick to your simple. What is the brick that you can grab and use to rebuild that which is broken around you? What is one simple thing you can begin doing that over the course of time will compound into something significant? Don't despise small beginnings, because small beginnings, when compounded over years of faithfulness, can become significant outcomes. They can become something significant and transformative, but most often, if not every time, something significant always starts as something small. You want to rebuild a wall, he could have been overwhelmed by that. But he's like, I guess I'll just grab a brick and get to work. What are some bricks that are in your hands? What are some things that you actually do have control over, something that you can do? How is it that you can begin to stick to your simple, and maybe over the course of 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, what could that simple commitment to a simple act of obedience, what could that compound into over the course of time? And this reminds me of something. And I think this is really important, especially in our social media world where you have these quote-unquote overnight successes, is that really success never happens overnight. Not true success, not sustainable success. If you built it overnight, it can fall apart just as quick. So if you want to build something that's sustainable, it's going to take years of obedience, years of faithfulness, years of one brick after another, after another, after another. And at the end of it, you might look back and go, my goodness, we just rebuilt the whole wall. I don't know if anyone changes the world on purpose, by the way. I think sometimes we think that's how it works. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think people were like, I did this thing, and when I did it, I knew I'm just going to change the whole world. Think about Rosa Parks. When she was told to move to the back of the bus and she said no, did she in that moment go, I said no because I knew this was going to spark a civil rights movement? No. In fact, we know for a fact that that's not why she refused to change her seat. When she was interviewed after this, the interviewer asked her, why didn't you move that day? And she said, I was tired. And the interviewer was like, you had a long day of work? And she's like, no, a different kind of tired. I was tired of giving in. And so this was this moment, I refused to do that any longer. It was this moment where she said, this is my brick. And it sparked a movement. I wonder what God's put in your hands that's already there for you to begin using to rebuild that which is broken around you. Some of you are frustrated with the diversity, equity, and inclusion in your workplace. And you're like, but I'm not the CEO, so I guess I'm just going to wait until I can start my own company, and then I can actually create DEI values and standards that I prioritize and think really matter. You don't need to start your own company. You're like, but Travis, I bring the CEO their coffee. Cool, Nehemiah brought the king his wine. So you can bring about change wherever you are, whoever you are, with whatever's in your hands. Maybe that for you is going to your CEO and saying, hey, I'd like to host and organize a DEI workshop and invite employees to you. It's not going to cost you anything financially or time. I'm just going to do this. And you begin one brick at a time to create space where that conversation becomes more of a priority in your organization. One brick. One brick. Some of you, you're like really passionate about the fashion industry, and you're convicted about fast fashion and how there are many companies that the reason the price is so cheap on that t-shirt is because it was built and made by the hands of impoverished people in underdeveloped countries, and they're profiting off of them. And you're like, man, I am not okay with this. This needs to change. We want people to have a better fashion ethic, to know where they're shopping and why and where that comes from and how it's affecting the lives of people and the planet we live on. And maybe not everyone shares that, but you're like, it is a passion of you. And you're like, but I can't, what am I going to do? Like take down H&M tomorrow? I can't do that. No, you can't, but you can start a blog. You can start a blog that creates content and resources for people who are wanting to have a fashion ethic and create awareness that maybe people didn't have. There's your brick. I know somebody here, I won't put her on the spot because she won't appreciate that, I don't think, but she's really passionate about parenting and raising healthy kids, and it's really difficult, it turns out. Parents, can I get an amen on that? And she's really passionate about creating resources and making them available for people so they can feel better equipped to raise their children. And, did she I'm going to reach every parent in the world? No, she created a resource and a website that is now available to parents. I mean, she's taking her brick and saying, okay, I want to rebuild the wall, and I'm going to do it one brick at a time. I want you to know that you have what you need to create change in the world today. You have what you need to live out the vision that God has instilled in you. Pay attention to the tension. Stick to your simple. Start rebuilding the wall one brick at a time. And then lastly, Nehemiah, he tells us this through his story, is you got to fight for your focus. You got to pay attention to the tension. You're going to stick with your simple, and you got to fight for your focus. Nehemiah, in Nehemiah chapter 6, he encounters a couple people. I call them swagger jackers. Have you ever known a swagger jacker before? People that just like to jack your swag. They're just haters, and they're miserable, and they're trying to take everyone down with them. Nehemiah experiences a couple of these sort of people in his life as he's rebuilding the wall. And I want you to pay attention to what he says to those who are trying to distract him from his great work. He says this in Nehemiah 6. So Sanballat and Geshem sent a message asking me to meet them at one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But I realized they were plotting to harm me. So I replied by sending this message to them. I am engaged in a great work, so I cannot come. Why should I stop working to come and meet with you? Can you imagine how much more focus you would have in your life if you started responding to distractions with that sort of confidence? I'm involved in a great work, so I cannot come to you. Why should I stop working to meet with you? I mean, that's what Nehemiah does. I love how he stands against these distractions. And I've noticed that people who are the most easily distracted are the ones who have the least amount of vision. Right? When you don't have vision, it's easy to become distracted. In fact, distract in Latin literally means to be pulled apart. So the visual of the word distract is this visual of somebody pulling your arm this way, your leg that way, and you just feel like you're slowly being pulled apart. I think that's a fairly accurate picture of what distraction feels like, right? And yet it makes sense then that if that is the picture for distraction, the word decide in Latin means to cut. To decide means to cut. You're not just saying, I'll do this or I'll do that. You're actually cutting some things out of your life or cutting things away from your life that might otherwise be pulling you apart or pulling you in different directions so that you can stay focused on what it is that is in front of you. Decide tells me that Each and every one of us are our own surgeons of our future. Like every time you decide, you are cutting something away in your life. I heard somebody say this before that, I don't know who said it, otherwise I give them credit, but they said something to the effect of, every time you say yes, you have less to give to something else. So make sure your yes is worth the less. Right? So make sure your yes is worth the less. If you're going to decide yes, make sure you're cutting away the right things. Because if you say yes, and now you have less of yourself to give to your vision, then that yes was not worth the less. And every time we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else. And I think the problem for some of us is not that you're choosing evil things over great things, but oftentimes that we choose good things over great things. That we decide to allocate our attention to good things instead of great things, which brings us to really this myth about how time works. I hear a lot of people that go, man, so many things are taking my time. Can we just bust that myth for a moment? Because it's a lie that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better about why we're not getting our vision done. But it's a lie. Because nothing takes your time. If something has your time, it's because you gave it to it. Nobody takes your time. You give your time away. And when you begin to change the verbiage there and understand, no one takes my time, I give my time. And so if that has my time, it's only because I've given it my time. And if you gave it your time, you can take it back. See, for many of us, we just need to take ownership of our calendars, ownership of our decisions, and understand that we have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's never going to be more than that. And so it is up to you and within your control every day to decide what you will cut and what you will keep. But make sure what you cut is worth the less. Make sure what you say yes to is worth the less. And I love Nehemiah. I love Nehemiah, right? They're like, hey, let's have a meeting. He's like, a meeting? My work is too great to have another meeting with you. Don't you wish you could say that to your boss some days? Come on. I don't know if I advise you going to your boss tomorrow and be like, well, Nehemiah said, I don't know if that's going to work out too well, but what if you did start doing that more in some ways, right? What if you actually did start prioritizing and protecting the great work that God has called you to? And God has called you to a great work. Do you believe that? I do not believe that God has created you so you can work for the weekend. I don't believe that life to the fullest is, man, I'm just working so hard so I can go on a 1-month break. Woo, that's life. No. You are created for so much more. What is your great work? I want to get to the point in my life where I'm doing such great work, I don't have time for good work. I want to get to the point where I've said yes to so much great work that I just don't have time for anything less than that. I'm not there yet, by the way. I'm not saying, hey, I've mastered this whole decision thing or this whole focus thing. Focus is, I don't know if anyone masters it. I think some days are better than others. But I think we can have more good days than bad days if we try a little bit more, right? We're like, what is your great work? Are you doing it? Or have you given? No, it hasn't taken. Have you given your focus to something that is a lesser work? I'll wrap up with this. Helen Keller, she has this really powerful quote. And she says, worse than being blind would be to be able to see but not have any vision. Worse than being blind would be to be able to see but not have any vision. Today, my sole focus in this talk is to remind you that there is a visionary within you. And God has, maybe even over the last couple years, begun to disrupt some things in your life. Pay attention to the tension. And maybe you know what your tension is. Maybe you have language for what your tension is. Then what you need to do is you need to stick to the simple. Because you have everything you need to do to begin to rebuild the wall. You have everything you need to do to begin to live out that vision. The question is, what is the brick in your hand? And will you actually begin to use it? And if you're going to pay attention to the tension and stick to your simple, if you're going to make it that far, man, you got to at least fight for your focus. You got to fight for your focus. Because I've realized if you do not decide what your great work is, somebody else will decide for you. If you don't decide, this is my great work, chances are you're going to help somebody else fulfill theirs. What is your great work that God has called you to do? You're going to have to fight for your focus because you are a visionary. You are more than a dreamer. And the world needs visionaries. We need visionaries in D.C. We need visionaries in local politics. We need visionaries in our hospitals. We need visionaries in tech. We need visionaries in fashion and entertainment. We need visionaries in the church. We need visionaries at home. We need visionaries in schools. We need visionaries in every sphere of public life, more than ever right now. We don't need people who are just going to talk about how wrong the world is. We need people who are actually going to go create a world that's worth fighting for and worth creating and worth passing on to the next generation. And I truly believe this is not hype. This is not hyperbole. This is not me just trying to amp you up today. I believe you are a visionary. And I believe all of you are meant to end up somewhere in life on purpose. But the question is, will you pay attention to the tension? Will you stick to your simple? Will you fight for your focus? And will you create that future? Now, understand this. And I promise I'll wrap up. I've said that like 3 times. Trust me, this is the last time. But I think sometimes where we get caught up, if you're anything like me, is we'll have a vision. We'll actually have some clarity on those 3 things. But we get stuck on the plans. We're like, I have a vision. I just don't know the plan. And you're like, so when I get the plan, then I'll do the vision. And I just want to encourage you today to write your plan in pencil, but write that vision in permanent ink. The plan is going to change. The plan is going to change. But the vision that God's birthing in your heart, I believe He's called you to it for the long haul. So take a step of faith. Grab a brick and start rebuilding what is broken in the world. Because your life is far too short, and your life is far too valuable to settle for anything less than a life of vision.